That is a good reason. Before the 1900s, when the Pentecostal movement started, was there documentation of speaking in tongues, healing, etc., other than the Bible? Was it common before the movement, is my question. So, common is not the right word. Just because something isn't common doesn't mean it's not true. But you do have a valid question. Is there documentation of it happening with anybody before what is commonly referred to as the birth of the Pentecostal movement? I can name 3 denominations right now that, according to official doctrine, still accept that the gifts of the Holy Spirit are active. And that is the Methodists, the Lutherans, and the Church of the Nazarene. And there are more. But you want historic examples? Okay, here we go. You might have heard of a guy named Eusebius. Well, in the 4th century, he wrote about his mentor, Montanus of Phrygia. He talked about how he would get carried away by the Spirit and would speak in other languages. Irenaeus, he was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a direct disciple of John the Apostle, and he wrote about the ability of speaking in tongues. One of his peers, Tertullian, also wrote about it. Pachomius wrote about how he was fervent in prayer until he was suddenly able to speak Latin and Greek. And then there was St. Augustine, who has a whole city named after him in Florida, and he wrote, "We still do what the apostles did when they laid hands on the Samaritans and called down the Holy Spirit on them by the laying on of hands. It is expected that converts should speak with new tongues." Moving on to the Dark Ages, you have St. Hildegard. You also have St. Vincent Ferrer of Valencia. In the first half of the 6th century, we have Francis Xavier and Louis Bertrand. Both were able to speak foreign language that they did not know during their mission work. Once we get into the Reformation, then there is quite a bit more that happens. Martin Luther himself was reportedly able to speak in tongues. In France in 1705, you had the group called the Jansenists, who were persecuted by the Catholic Church because there was reports of speaking in tongues amongst their group. In the 17th century in Great Britain, you had the Society of Friends or Quakers, who were developing characteristics that would be very congruent with the modern Pentecostal movement. In that same time and region, out of the Quakers came a group that was mockingly called the Shakers, and they also experienced not only speaking in tongues, but prophesying and other spiritual gifts. One of the more prominent groups in Great Britain is actually the Irvingites. In 1825 is kind of when they started, and their pastor was Edward Irving. That's why they were given that name. So even though the early 1900s is when most people attribute the Pentecostal movement to starting, there are documentations of people who speak in tongues and declare healing upon people and prophesy, and God honoring all of those abilities. This is not to say that everybody does it everywhere, but not everybody is seeking the gifts. Remember what James says. He says, "You have not because you ask not, and when you ask amiss." If you are wanting to have gifts just to see if they're real, that's not a good reason. If you're wanting to have gifts so you can bring glory to yourself, that's not a good reason. But if you are humbling yourself saying, "God, I want to be equipped for the work you want me to do, and if it will help me do that work, give me any spiritual gifts you're willing," then